was only when I was able to get through to say, man, and he has moved Lou Palmer out of the picture altogether because of Lou's wife, Georgia, who was an insulting woman about Harold. And so when that began to be clear to him that people like the present president of the judicial Evans, Timothy Evans.
Timothy Evans.
The division of him and Gene Sawyer.
Right.
We tried to get them closer together so that he would know who was on his side and who wasn't. But coming out of the
well, and at that time, Tim Evans was the alderman who was the chairman of the Finance Committee.
That's right.
Once the Washington forces took over the city council after the redistricting case was won.
That's absolutely correct. But they didn't want people like the Tim Blacks, the Jesus Garcia. They didn't want people like that close to Harold. And we were trying to get to him to tell him what was happening, because the machine hadn't dropped off. It's just got new leadership. Moving to get those populations separated. Sad story. When he was elected, my wife, who had volunteered, my young wife, who had volunteered to help him, and she did, there was no job for her. She had left her job in the school system, I guess depending on her old husband, to keep the ball rolling. She was the chief volunteer that got other volunteers, no job. I had to go to Harold and say, look, you know, Harold wanted me to come into the, but I'm independent. I'm not going to get that close. I want to be critical if I have to. And one of the people who had worked in the Democratic Party with him and all, she, I think we better wrap this up. She wants.
We have 2 more minutes.
All right, well, let me get these 2 minutes. She, the point is the people that had helped him were no longer close to him and couldn't get to him. So when I went to up with another person, Georgia English, I went to take her to try and get her in, because she had worked for Harold too. And he said laughingly, you had a movement going, but you let me break the movement up. Through the passionate system, he had separated the west side and the south side, and individuals in all kinds of ways. And so he had very few friends around him, real honest friends. And when they began to work, then he had to do all the work, almost by himself. And so last day of his life, I had a student, a Chinese student in my class, and she wanted to talk with me about some other matters. He was from mainland China. Someone poked their head in my office door and said, Mr. Black, the mayor has fallen. My head went one way, my heart went another way. The Chinese girl started crying. That's how much the election of a black mayor from Chicago had touched other places in the world.
Right. Well, why don't we stop there?
Okay.
This is the 3rd tape, and I'm Gary Johnson. Today's the 9th of June. We're at the Chicago History Museum. Once again, could you please state your name?
My name is Timuel, Timuel. D as in David, Black, Black.
Okay, now we've talked about many different phases of your life here in Chicago. Let's go back to the era of the late Richard J. Daley and talk about another struggle, and that was the struggle for school reform. And how were you involved in efforts at public school reform?
In 1954, well, previous to that, there had been those of us who realized that the separation by custom or law of students meant that the students whose background had the most power would get the best resources for education. Those who had less organization would get the least. Exemplified, of course, by the Southern experience. So there were those of us who were demanding equality in education. There were those in power who were dedicated to denying that equality. After the organizing of the Progressive Party in 1948 and participated in by people of various groups, we were moving in the direction in Chicago of making the educational system more equal for all. And that would mean desegregation. You'd find a school like in Hyde Park as people began to move to the suburbs. Hyde Park High School had empty classrooms because the exclusion of kids who were going to schools where they had double shifts, even triple shifts. In walking distance of a school that had empty classrooms. Because of that, and because the union began to get stronger, there were people like Mary Herrick, the late Mary Herrick, who was a fantastic person, began to demand that those classrooms be filled up with similar kinds of students, regardless of race. And when the mayor became, in 1954, in Brown versus Board of Education, I was back teaching at not at Hyde Park, at DuSable. It was also the year that DuSable High School had one of the greatest prep school basketball teams in the country. In fact, I got a call the day before yesterday and yesterday. They want to talk about that and the book that was written by a Sen High School kid about that team. Example, the team broke the segregation because they were so good. In the Big Ten, first black players at University of Indiana, Illinois. There was Washington, University of Washington, all which had been previously, because they decided they wanted to win, they brought in these talented black, and DuSable was one of those. So equality in education in terms of opportunities, or DuSable like that because of dedication of teachers, rather than resources. DuSable doesn't have nearly what would be true at New Trier in terms of resources. So the idea of the school desegregation became an important thing. Now, the idea was if you have control of the resources, then you could equalize more easily. And with Ms. Herrick and others like her, but nobody really like her, but I mean, attempt to be like her. Brought in a superintendent, whose name I forget now, who was an integrationist. And he began to do that integration, began to fill up those empty classrooms, redistribute the wealth, the money, so that there was more equality. Daley's elected in 1955. There were those who believed that schools should be separated. And he was told by the State Street Business Association, or whatever that was named, that if they integrated the schools, the wealthy and the middle class whites who kept support of the State Street corridor would leave if blacks were too close with their children to the school. He accepted that and then got rid of that superintendent who was an integrationist to bring in a avowed segregationist, Benjamin Willis. And Benjamin Willis came in and immediately began to resegregate the public schools. That's when the marches on schools began to occur regularly.
Now, what was your own involvement in this?
Well, at this point, I'd helped to organize. That was Saul Mendelson. That's who I've been trying to think about.
Who is it?
Saul Mendelson.
Ah, Saul Mendelson.
Yeah, who was
from our second tape, who was working with the Latino voting group.
That's right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So we had strengthened the union greatly, and we felt that the mixing of students along racial and economic lines would enrich intellectually all the groups. Willis began to reconstitute that. And with the breakdown in housing discrimination, people could move closer to public schools that were efficient, like moving into Hyde Park, where the schools were, because of the president of the university, excellent public schools. My kids were pretty smart, but I don't know whether my son, my late son, could have gone to that fancy school out east, that the Daleys, not the Daleys, but the president went to.
Harvard?
No, no, first the prep school.
Oh, the prep schools, right.
Oh, God. Again. But then
Groton, Exeter, one of those.
One of those in that category. I have it because I just gave $4,000 in scholarships in the name of mine. So at least he left the money for that purpose. And then on to Stanford, and then on to, that the kind of preparation.